Hey everyone, this is a piece titled The Theory of State Capitalism by Peter Binns. It's a collection it's a piece from a collection titled Russia from Worker State to State Capitalism, put out by Haymarket Press. It's got Anthony Arnaud, Peter Binns, Tony Cliff, Chris Harman, and Ahmed Shawki. The purpose of reading this is I'm writing a master's thesis on Trotskyist critiques of the degenerated worker state thesis, and I'm trying to get a better feel for the Cliff's critique. Alright, so here we go. Everyone who argues for the need for a socialist solution to the problems of our own society is sooner or later to face the question of Russia. This self-proclaimed, quote, socialist state has, after all, been responsible for some vile monstrosities. Were they, quote, socialist slave labor camps in the Gulag archipelago? Were they, quote, socialist tanks that smashed the Hungarian workers' revolt in 1956? Did, quote, socialist helicopter gunships strafe villages in Afghanistan in the 1980s? And what about the, quote, socialist imprisonment of workers all over Eastern Europe for arguing for free trade unions, most notably today in Poland? There are two bad answers to these questions. First is the most popular. The rulers of Britain, the USSR, and the USA, Thatcher, Gorbachev, and Reagan, all subscribe to it in one form or another. So too do all too many people on the left. They all agree that Russia really is an example of a socialist society, or is at least on the road to socialism. If they are right, we may as well discard Marxism altogether. Given Russia's faltering growth rate and Russia's continued repression of workers, if this were socialism, then Marxism would have lost all credibility as the theory of the liberation of the masses of ordinary working people. The second bad answer is to say that Russia, while not being on the road to socialism, is a new form of post-capitalist society. That too seriously undermines the socialist strategy at home. For what is there to stop a revolution here going in the same direction? At least under capitalism, workers have the right to organize. At least here under capitalism, workers have the right to organize. Shouldn't one then defend a bourgeois democracy against the possibility of a, quote, post-capitalist dictatorship, even if the likelihood of it happening is slight? One of the founders of this view, Max Shachtman, ended up supporting American imperialism in Vietnam as a result of following the logic of this argument to its conclusion. But neither of these is our view. A proper understanding of Russia today based on Marx's analysis of capitalism will reveal it to be a form of capitalism itself, state capitalism, and neither on the road to socialism nor to an entirely new kind of society. The Russian social system is not different in kind from societies in the West. Russia is an imperialist capitalist power in just the same way that they are, and obeys the same underlying laws of development. It cannot be made socialist by a few reforms here and there, but as in the West will require a full-scale workers' revolution against the ruling class and the entire social fabric that preserves their rule. To see why this is so, we must begin by looking at Russia today. New section. The working class in Russia today. The position of the working class in Russia today is the exact opposite of what it was when it made the 1917 revolution. Then councils or Soviets of workers were the basis of all political power. Again, this is consistent with all Trotskyists, a very rosy view of the early days of the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. Today, workers are powerless. This is not the place to explain how the revolution was lost. It has been done elsewhere, but the extent of the reversal should be noted. The income differentials between workers and bosses is every bit as great as the worst the West has to offer in such places as Brazil and the Philippines, and rather greater than in Britain, Germany, Japan, and the USA. The spending power of ministers or the president of an academy is at least 60 times the minimum wage paid to office or manual workers. One second. Got to get to the notes because it's got endnotes instead of footnotes. Sorry. Okay. See The Economist, 5th of April, 1986. Back to the text. Or, end footnote. Quote, trade unions, apart from organizing holidays, are basically devoted to squeezing more production out of the workers. Trade unions are organs of the state, which workers are powerless to control. And should workers try to change this, they are automatically suppressed. Viktor Klebanov is just one of many workers jailed or confined to psychiatric hospital for the crime of arguing for the setting up of genuinely free trade unions. So afraid is the bureaucracy of open discussion that all copying and duplicating facilities are kept under lock and key. The secret police even monitor the whereabouts of every single typewriter in the USSR. This exploitation and powerlessness of the Russian working class is nothing new. It came about more than 50 years ago. The final vestiges of workers' rights disappeared in 1929, when it was decreed that all managers' orders were now to be, quote, unconditionally binding on, their subordinate, be, quote, unconditionally binding on subordinate administrative staff and on all workers, end quote. Footnote. CPSU Central Committee Resolution, September 1929, quoted in Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia. End footnote. It was at this time that the trade unions ceased to be able to play any function on behalf of the workers, in particular over the negotiation of wages. An internal passport system was introduced, and in 1930 all industrial enterprises were forbidden to employ workers who left their former jobs without permission. Footnote. See Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia, page 23. End footnote. Forced or slave labor was introduced on a massive scale as Stalin's terror campaign against the workers gathered momentum in the 1930s. As the Russian authorities themselves cynically put it, quote, with the entry of the USSR into the period of socialism, the possibility of using coercive measures by corrective labor have immeasurably increased, end quote. Footnote. Cliff, Russia, a Marxist analysis. In Russia, the state owns the means of production, but who owns the state? Certainly not the workers! Exclamation point. Although Russia's rulers still refer to it as the, quote, Soviet Union, the whole idea of a state democratically run by recallable delegates of workers is complete anathema to Gorbachev and company. In fact, all efforts to start any independent workers' initiatives, let alone workers' councils, are now repressed and standardly rewarded with extreme forms of repression. From the late 1920s, a centralized plan for the economy has been imposed by the leaders on workers and peasants who have had no rights even to object to what has been decided. At the beginning of this process, Kirov, Stalin's second in command at the time, accurately prophesied, quote, we shall be pitiless to those lacking in firmness in the factories and the villages who fail to carry out the plan, end quote. Footnote. See Victor Serge, From Lenin to Stalin. End footnote. Thousands of managers were imprisoned for not repressing their workers enough, and in one incident in 1953, hundreds of slave laborers were shot down for striking over the failure of the authorities to carry out promises of an amnesty. Footnote, see Cliff, A Marxist Analysis, page 286. Russia, A Marxist Analysis, 286. Thousands of where am I? Today, the response is more sophisticated. Dissident workers who try to set up the most rudimentary forms of workers' defense, such as free trade unions, are now classified as insane and locked up in mental asylums, but the end result is the same. The periodic elections that take place in Russia are also a complete fraud. For a start, all decisions are taken by completely unelected bodies. These are then rubber stamped by the, quote, elected body. Even the highest elected body, the, quote, Supreme Soviet, has formal and not real powers. For instance, none of the 5- and 7-year plans, and none of the sharp turns in foreign policy that marked Stalin's period of office were ever discussed by this supposedly supreme organ of state until they had already been implemented. Furthermore, quote, elections for this body to take place in constituencies where there is never more than one candidate standing, nominated from above by the completely undemocratic Communist Party, and where he or she never gets less than 93% of the poll, but sometimes, as with Stalin in 1947, is known to quote, receive as much as 147%. Footnote, see Pravda, 22nd of December 1947, quoted in Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia. End footnote. So while the state owns the means of production, it would obviously be complete nonsense to believe that the workers own the state. What kind of society, then, is Russia? Certainly, it is not socialist. The absolute lack of any form of workers' power is clear enough proof of that. But on the other hand, it lacks private owners of capital competing with each other, as is normally the case in the West. And this is kind of like a staple feature of like Cliff's understanding of state capitalism, is that there is no kind of like internal operation of the law of value. What makes it capitalist is international competition, primarily military competition. To my understanding, at least. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Certainly Russia is not socialist. The absolute lack of any form of workers' power is clear enough proof of that. But on the other hand, it lacks private owners of capital competing with each other, as is normally the case in the West. To answer this question, therefore, we must first look at capitalism, and in particular at Marx's analysis of capitalism's underlying features. New section, Capitalism and Rapidly Changing Societies. The main reason it is so often assumed that Russia cannot be part of the world capitalist system is because capitalism itself is seen in a certain rather simplistic way. According to this view, capitalism consists of 1. Private ownership of the means of production, 2. The regulation of production not by state planning, but by the impersonal, quote, laws of supply and demand, end quote. And 3. It is assumed that competition between the capitalists takes place only in the marketplace, and only through the price of commodities sold there. It is then but a short step to define socialism in simply opposition to this, as a society in which there is 1. Nationalization of the means of production, 2. State planning, and 3. No free market competition. The above-mentioned Schachtman would not view these as sufficient conditions of socialism. But rather can be the basis of a new class society that is non-capitalist. Although the society of mid-19th century Britain, in which Marx wrote Capital, came close to this classic picture, this is not at all Marx's own view of the matter. Marx was well aware, for instance, that capitalism began in England in the 17th and 18th centuries, with looting and slave labor in the colonies as part of its productive base. It also began with trade, but trade based on the vigorous intervention of the state and the denial of anything free about the market at all. the so-called, quote, mercantilist system. In discussing the dawn of capitalism, Marx stresses not only the growth of the wages system, but the, quote, discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into the warren of the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production, ... Great fortunes sprang up like mushrooms in a day. Primitive accumulation went on without the advance of a shilling, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, Moscow edition. Pages 751 to 753. And footnote. Instead of the, quote, invisible hand of the laws of supply and demand, in Britain there was a, quote, systematic combination embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend in part on brute force, e.g. the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, page 751. Instead of the, quote, where am I? That is why Marx warns us, quote, if, then, the specific form of capital is abstracted away, and only the content is emphasized, ... capital is conceived as a thing, not as a relation, ... bracket, but, end bracket. Capital is not a simple relation, but a process, in whose various moments it is always capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, London, 1973, page 258. Because capital is a process, and a process which contains contradictions, capital is always changing itself as capital develops. We need to understand capital's dynamic, the underlying principle according to which capital changes and develops. Capitalism remains capitalism through its various changes because capitalism's central dynamic, capitalism's internal motor, remains unchanged, and capitalism's internal motor, and it is to this, capitalism's internal motor, central dynamic, that we now turn. New section. Accumulation, the key to capitalism's development. The thing which links the early stage of capitalist development, based on monopoly, looting, and slavery, with later stages like those of 19th century private capitalism and 20th century state capitalism, is the nature of the accumulation process. In all these stages, the direct producers are exploited, and the fruits of this exploitation, Marx called it, quote, surplus value, end quote, is accumulated in further means of production. This is quite unlike what happened in pre-capitalist societies, such as feudalism in the ancient world, where exploitation led not to accumulation, but rather to the ruling class consuming in more and opulent ways. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx neatly summarizes this point and contrasts the capitalist and socialist modes of production. In the former, quote, ... the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to enrich, to widen, to promote the existence of the laborer. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to enrich, to widen, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. End quote. Marx, The Communist Manifesto. I feel like where this is heading is that growth as an end that is distinct from the immediate interest of the direct producers and control and managed by a group separate from the direct producers equals capitalism. That's my guess of where this is going, which I think is a goofy idea. The crucial thing about capitalism is that it's a society in which, firstly, the exploited creative energy of the working class becomes piled up in an ever-expanding quantity of productive forces. And secondly, the past history of this accumulation is the central determinant of what is happening now in capitalist society. In Capital, Marx develops this point more fully. He stresses that the motive force of capitalism is not the consumption of the capitalist, but the fact that in order to fulfill his role as a capitalist at all, he has to accumulate. Quote, the capitalist's own private consumption is a robbery perpetrated on accumulation. ... Accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets. ... Therefore, save, i.e., reconvert the greatest possible portion of surplus value or surplus product into capital. Accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake. ... What then makes this drive to accumulation and the subordination of the whole of society to it possible in the first place? The factors are needed. Together they give us a society fully ruled by the laws of capitalism. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, pages 592 to 595. As true as this is, capitalists are also incentivized to accumulate because their private consumption will also expand as a result of this accumulation, right? If you have a small business and you just spend all the money you get from the small business, won't be nearly, your consumption will be very much limited in comparison if you reinvest those earnings in the expansion of the base, the preconditions for that luxurious private consumption. Yeah. That's just a side note for me. I'm not particularly sure what the relevance is, but it's important. Because you could get from that description. Obviously, there isn't personal reasons why a capitalist does have to accumulate, and the pressures of competition accumulate that dictate that the capitalists operate within a certain circle of rationality, which is highly limited and hostile to human purposes. But also this idea that the capitalist drive to accumulate has nothing to do with private consumption, I think, is a mistake. And I don't think it's I don't think that's contradictory with in contradiction to the general thrust of what Marx says here. Firstly, the working class must be forcibly separated from the ownership and control of the means of production. This is crucial. Without this separation, workers would never consent to their own exploitation. If workers controlled production as a whole, it would be subordinated to fulfilling workers' needs. In other words, to consumption. They might, of course, freely decide to set aside a portion of production to expand future production, but this would be a different matter altogether. It would only be a means to the further end of consumption. Workers would rule accumulation rather than being ruled by accumulation. Secondly, there has to be competition between those who own the means of production. Without it, each capitalist could freely decide whether to consume the fruits of the exploitation of the working class, to accumulate the fruits of the exploitation, or even to return the fruits of the exploitation to the workers who created the fruits of the exploitation. What makes the system into a capitalist system is that the capitalist is compelled to accumulate the fruits of exploitation. The compulsion comes from the process of competition, which threatens each capitalist with extinction by rival capitalists if that capitalist doesn't invest in the most modern and efficient equipment, and hence accumulate capital. That is why, as Marx put it, quote, competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production be felt by each capitalist as external coercive laws, end quote. Just a side note for myself, this is a personal opinion. That feeling of the immanent laws of capitalist production being external coercive laws has reality and is not just a feeling. And it fundamentally dictates the way that each capitalist, as was just already said, that it fundamentally dictates the way each capitalist has to arrange production under their command. New section. Competition, the mainspring of capitalism. Competition, then, is the mainspring of capitalism. Competition drives on the process of the accumulation of capital. For Marx, is it, quote, nothing other than the inner nature of capital, appearing in and realized as the reciprocal interaction of many capitals with one another. For Marx, competition is, quote, nothing other than the inner nature of capital, appearing in and realized as the reciprocal interaction of many capitals with one another, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse, page 414. But while it drives on the accumulation process itself reacts back on it, and in doing so can transform the mechanisms of competition in crucial ways. Even though Marx was writing Capital at the high point of classic laissez-faire capitalism, Marx is well aware of this in general terms. Marx knew, for instance, as we have already mentioned, that the capital accumulation process in the 17th and 18th centuries led not to less, but to more state involvement in the marketplace. Marx also knew that this involved a strengthening of military competition between the newly emerging states. Marx recognized that the form of competition is continuously changing by the accumulation process. This was not just something confined to capitalism's infancy, but had immediate implications for the capitalism of Marx's own day as well. Crisis, Marx argued, was endemic to capitalism, and crisis led not only to the increase in the size of the capitals which confront each other as a result of accumulation, but also to a reduction in the numbers of independent units of capital that remain to confront each other. Footnote, Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 25. In a period of crisis, some companies will be forced out of business, their accumulation of capital, factories, goods, machinery, and so on, being taken over by other, even larger capitalists. Competition thus leads to the concentration and the centralization of capital. Marx remarked, quote, today, therefore, the force of attraction, drawing together individual capitals, and the tendency to centralization are stronger than ever before, ... In any given branch of industry, centralization would reach centralization's extreme limit if all the individual capitals invested in that branch of industry were fused into a single capital, as in like a monopoly. That's a side note for me. In a given society, the limit would be reached only when the entire social capital is united in the hands of either a single capitalist or a single capitalist company, end quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 1, pages 626 to 27. In Marx's own lifetime, the most important channel for the centralization of capital was not the merger or the takeover bid, but the conversion of an individual's capital into his part ownership of a joint stock company. I'm trying to think right now, like, never mind. Quote, "This is the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, and hence a self-dissolving contradiction, which prima facie represents a mere phase of transition to a new form of production. It manifests itself as such a contradiction in its effects. It establishes a monopoly in certain spheres and thereby requires state interference. It reproduces a new financial aristocracy, a new variety of parasites in the shape of promoters, speculators, and simple nominal directors, a whole system of swindling and cheating by means of corporation promotion, stock issuance, and stock speculation. It is private production without the control of private property." End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. Updating this passage in the 1890s, Engels commented, quote, "Since Marx wrote the above, new forms of industrial enterprise have developed, ... The old boasted freedom of competition has reached the end of its tether and must itself announce its obvious, scandalous bankruptcy, ... In some branches, ... competition has been replaced by monopoly." End quote. Engels. Preface to Capital, Volume 3. Arguing against socialists in Germany who wanted to simply identify capitalism with private production, Engels, in his critique of the Erfurt program, writes, quote, "I know of capitalist production as a social form, as an economic stage, and of capitalist private production as a phenomenon occurring one way or another within that stage. What does capitalist private production mean, then? Production by a single entrepreneur, and that is, of course, becoming more and more an exception. Capitalist production through limited companies is already no longer private production, but production for the combined account of many people. And when we move on to the trusts, which control and monopolize whole branches of industry, then that means an end not only to the private production, but also to the planlessness." End quote. Engels. Critique of the Erfurt program. Marx and Engels then are very clear on a number of points. Firstly, the capitalist production process produces and will inevitably go on producing fewer but much bigger concentrations of capital. Secondly, this implies that, as the capitalist system ages, the quote invisible hand of the laws of supply and demand posited by Adam Smith no longer suffice to regulate the economy. Marx talks about production under these circumstances as being, quote, "without the control of private production," end quote. And Marx argues that it, quote, "requires state interference," end quote. For Engels, quote, "the old boasted freedom of competition has reached the end of its tether," end quote. And, quote, "that means an end, ... to ... private production," end quote. Finally, and crucially, both Marx and Engels are very clear that under these circumstances we do not have a new post-capitalist mode of production. Certainly Marx talks of it as the, quote, "abolition of the capitalist mode of production," end quote, but then immediately adds, quote, "within the capitalist mode of production itself," end quote, as if to say it appears to be a move away from the capitalist mode of production when looked at in isolation, but is really an intrinsic part of it when seen in the context of the dynamic of the system as a whole. And Engels has no hesitation at all in dismissing the view that capitalist production can only take place under conditions of, quote, "private production" and, quote, "planlessness," end quote. The rapid rise in the role of the state in the Western capitalist economies in the 20th century confirms Marx and Engels' analysis on this point. By the 1960s in Italy, the state was responsible for the majority of fixed capital formation. In Bangladesh in the 1970s, the state held 85% of the assets of what it termed, quote, "modern industrial enterprise," end quote. In Algeria, it was employing 51% of all workers in industry, construction, and trade in 1972. In Turkey, it was responsible for 40% of value added in industry in 1964. In Brazil, well over 60% of all investment by the mid-1970s, and in Britain for 45% of fixed capital formation in the same period. Footnote. For the sources of this information, see Peter Binns and Mike Haynes' article, New Theories of Eastern European Class Societies, published in International Socialism, 2nd Series, number 7, Winter 1980, page 30. End footnote. But this immediately raises a further question. If planlessness in private production is but one stage in the development of capitalism, and yet competition remains capitalism's, quote, inner essence, what form can competition take which is not tied to this private form of property, but which can still regulate production and cause the dynamic of capitalist development to continue? New section, Aging Capitalism in the West. As we have seen, at the end of the golden age of 19th century private production, Engels was writing of, quote, private production and, quote, planlessness as but one, quote, stage of capitalism's development. Yet at no point did Engels even question that competition is capitalism's, quote, inner essence. Clearly implicit in this is the understanding that competition must be able to take on forms other than that of price competition between commodities produced by private capitals for an autonomous market. Such considerations of these formed the starting point for the most fruitful developments of Marxist theory at the beginning of this century. Grappling with the rapid drive of the system to imperialism and world war, Lenin, Bukharin, and others basing their ideas on these premises, began to argue, Jesus Christ, that, quote, peaceful competition was more and more turning into a variety of more violent forms, the physical seizure of colonies and raw materials, the exclusion of rival capitalists by the erection of tariff walls, and above all the threat or the actual use of direct military power itself. For Bukharin, supported by Lenin, this is due to two main consequences of capitalist crisis, as explained by Marxist theory. Footnote. Lenin not only wrote the preface to Bukharin's major book, Imperialism and World Economy, but was recommending it as the major text on the subject as late as 1921. End footnote. Firstly, within each country, economic power is becoming concentrated and centralized in the hands of fewer and fewer giant corporations. Secondly, in order to exploit the efficiencies implicit in a world division of labor, each capital is becoming impelled to extend its tentacles beyond its own national borders. The first tendency implies a greater and greater integration of the corporation with the state. The second implies an extension of its operations overseas. The combination of the two necessarily leads to the national state bursting through the national state's purely geographical borders, and in the long run to the collision of one state's external tentacles with those of another. But there is a difference between this and the situation where one purely private capital confronts another. When one state or state-backed corporation collides with another, this implies that the sharper the conflict, the more it will take on a directly military form, and the more the corporations will take on the form of what Bukharin called, quote, state capitalist trusts. Quote, when competition has reached its highest stage, then the use of state power and possibilities connected with it begin to play a very large part. But even if free competition were entirely eliminated within the boundaries of, quote, national economies, crises would still continue, as there would remain the anarchic structure of world economy, This anarchic structure of world capitalism is expressed in two facts: world industrial crises on the one hand, wars on the other. The struggle between state capitalist trusts is decided in the first place by the relation between their military forces. For the military power of the country is the last resort of the struggling, quote, national groups of capitalists. End quote. And that quote was from Bukharin. Footnote. Quoted in Peter Bin's Understanding the New Cold War, published in International Socialism, spring 1983. It follows from this analysis, end footnote. It follows from this analysis that two tendencies are simultaneously and mutually implicit in aging capitalism. The first is the growing together of capital and the state, and the second is the tendency for war between the various increasingly statized capitals. The two are not at all separate, but one mutually implies the other. The two are not at all separate, but one mutually implies the other. That's in italics. It's important to stress this point. If you accept that aging capitalism implies imperialism and war along the lines that the classical Marxists argued, the corollary is that this involves, and must involve, the increasing statization of capital, and that the more any national capital or group of capitals is statized, the more its mutual competition with other capitals will take the form of direct military competition. In short, long before the processes gave rise to Stalin's rule in Russia had occurred, the world economy had already moved decisively into a new epoch. It is true that many barriers existed which prevented these tendencies referred to by Lenin and Bukharin from being at all fully implemented at the time in the West. Still others were partially, though only partially, dismantled for a temporary period of time in the 1920s. For all that, the central point remains. The world which surrounded Russia after Stalin rose to power out of the ashes of the 1917 revolution was one which was pressurizing all the component states in the system to play a more central role in the economy than ever before. When Stalin and the Russian bureaucracy moved so decisively in this direction themselves in 1928 thereafter, it was not at all against the trend of world capitalism. On the contrary, it fitted it like a hand fits a glove. New section. Russia considered in isolation from the rest of the world. How then does the Russian economy and state appear today in this context? Two features, as we saw earlier, were necessary for the specifically capitalist tendency of accumulation for the sake of accumulation. 1. Separation of the workers from the means of production, and 2. Competition between the capitalists. Obviously, the first of these exists in an extreme form in Russia. It is more developed than in the West due to the increased power of oppression of a totalitarian police state. But what about the second feature? Overwhelmingly, it is the case that within the Russian economy there is centralized administration of production. Individual productive units have rarely been autonomous or in competition with each other. In Western capitalism, we are used to the attempt to plan and cooperate within any given enterprise, coupled with competition outside it. In Russia, considered purely on Russia's own, lacks the mechanisms for introducing this competitive element. As Tony Cliff puts it, quote, the division of labor within Russian society is in essence a species of the division of labor within a single workshop, end quote. Footnote, Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia, page 203, end footnote. If any one capitalist enterprise, General Motors or IBM, say, had successfully managed to take over the whole of the world economy, capitalism would have ceased to exist. Competition between capitals would end, and therefore so too would accumulation for the sake of accumulation, and production for the sake of accumulation. This would not be socialism, of course, but a new class society. One which Bukharin characterized as an industrial, quote, slave-owning economy where the slave market is absent, end quote. Footnote, Bukharin, Imperialism and World Economy, page 157. End footnote. This gives us an accurate picture of what Russia might have been like had it been possible to remain in isolation from the rest of the world, just like this, but on a smaller scale. What this means is that if Russia were unaffected by the world around Russia, Russia could no longer be a society explicable by the laws of capitalism. What this means is that if Russia were unaffected by the world around Russia, Russia could no longer be a society explicable by the laws of capitalism. Enterprise in Russia would not be forced by mutual competition to accumulate. The purpose of production would be the creation of use values rather than the revenue obtained from selling use values. Russia would have become a gigantic corporation in which the state had become the repository of all the means of production. In these two respects, state ownership of the means of production and use values is the purpose of production, and in these respects alone, it would resemble a workers' state. It would also resemble Egypt of the pharaohs and the ancient civilizations of Assyria and the Indus Valley, not just in these two respects, but also as a hierarchical class society in which the producers themselves did not control production. New section: the beginning of state capitalism in Russia. But of course, Russia never could have been isolated from the rest of the world. Lenin was an internationalist not just because Lenin wanted world socialism, but because Lenin knew that the only way to get socialism anywhere, including Russia, was for the working class to seize power in the dominant industrial capitalist countries. Quote, "We always staked our play upon an international revolution, and this was unconditionally right, ... We always emphasized ... the fact that in one country it is impossible to accomplish such a work as a socialist revolution." End quote. Lenin. Again, in March 1919, Lenin repeated, quote, "We do not live merely in a state, but in a system of states, and the existence of the Soviet Republic side by side with imperialist states for any length of time is inconceivable. In the end, one or the other must triumph." End quote. Lenin, quoted in Trotsky, the Third International after Lenin, 1936, page 13. End footnote. Lenin made it clear that the source of this incompatibility was not just the military intervention of the imperialist powers against Russia after the revolution, but Russia's economic dependence upon the surrounding capitalist states. For Lenin refers to the, quote, ... international market to which we are subordinated, with which we are connected, and from which we cannot escape, end quote. Lenin. The extreme backwardness of Russia in an age of imperialism forced Russia to industrialize rapidly. If the revolutions in Germany and elsewhere had succeeded, plenty of means of production and skilled labor could have flowed into Russia to accomplish this task. But when the perspective changed from stressing the need to spread the revolution internationally to stressing the building of, quote, socialism in a single country as proposed by Stalin in 1924, the situation was completely reversed. If industrialization was to take place in Russia in isolation, industrialization could take place by extracting huge surpluses from the working class and by forcing many peasants off the land into the mines and steel mills. The new ruling bureaucracy could only retain power insofar as it could succeed in this task. It required a vast terror apparatus to subordinate the consumption of the masses to the accumulation needs of the Russian state. For a time, Stalin tried to avoid this logic. He allied with the right wing in the Bolshevik Party, which spoke of, quote, proceeding towards socialism at a snail's pace, end quote, without attacks on the peasantry. But this meant that what accumulation there was in the years 1923 to 28 went into the social services, education, agriculture, and food, rather than heavy industry. Very little progress was made in these years towards catching up with the West. An increase in international tension in 1927 showed the danger of the policy. Without a more rapid rate of accumulation, there was no way, other than international revolution, already ruled out by Stalin, of defending Russia. Stalin was forced to change tack and follow a policy which went for all-out accumulation, regardless of the interests of Russian workers or, for that matter, individual bureaucrats. The state was thus cut loose from its original social base. Having become heavily bureaucratized, it moved decisively to take upon itself the role of massive capital accumulation in the first five-year plan of 1928 to 33. It did so because of the increasing pressure from world imperialism. As Stalin put it in 1931, quote, "No, comrades, ... the pace must not be slackened, ... On the contrary, we must quicken our pace We must quicken the pace as much as is within our powers and possibilities, ... To slacken the pace would be to tag behind, and those who, would be to lag behind, and those who lag behind are beaten, ... We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us, ... Stalin. The last vestiges of workers' control were eliminated from the factories. Real wages were slashed and a general speed-up was introduced. Peasants were forcibly driven off the land to become factory fodder in the cities. The bureaucracy thus began a massive primitive accumulation of capital. The results were immediate. Investment in industry expanded 6 times its 1923 to 28 level in the years 1928 to 1933, and therefore doubled in each of the succeeding 5-year periods. Footnote, see Tony Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia, page 39. New section. The imposition of capitalist relations of production. In Russia, the subordination of consumption to the needs of accumulation took on an extreme form. From the beginning of the first 5-year plan, capital accumulation absorbed more than 20% of the national income, and it increased in subsequent plans. This was higher than any of the developed countries outside Russia, but about the same as the USA and Japan in their equivalent periods of development. And shows clearly that this most characteristic symptom of capitalism, the domination of society by capital accumulation, was fully developed in Russia at that time. Again, capital being conflated with productive forces or means of production. Accumulation and not consumption thus became the goal of production in Russia. Acting as the agent of the accumulation of capital, the bureaucracy emerged as the collective capitalist at the same pace as the economy itself took on the same features of the giant corporations in the nations of the West against which Russia was competing. The bureaucracy's monopoly of foreign trade enabled it to seal off Russia from price competition. The bureaucracy's monopoly of foreign trade enabled it to seal off Russia from price competition. But strategic and military competition completely dominated the process of capital formation in Russia from the moment accumulation became the bureaucracy's central concern in 1928. This is so weird because he's talking about the need to rapidly industrialize the country just a second ago. But then, but it then acts as if it's perverse that this would be the bureaucracy's central concern. Yeah. From the beginning of the 5-year plans, armaments dominated the accumulation process. For instance, in machine-building plants, which are probably the best gauge of the development of accumulation, already by 1932, munition plants accounted for as much as 46% of total iron and steel consumed. By 1938, this figure had risen to the staggering sum of 94%, and virtually all other machinery plant construction had ceased. Footnote. See Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia, page 46. Accumulation in the period before the Second World War was dominated by strategic and military competition from the Western nations. This was even more true for Russia after the war. Between 1953 and 1965, approximately twice as large a percentage of the national income was spent on armaments as in the 1930s, even though the proportion of total income accumulated throughout the economy remained largely unchanged. Footnote. See S. Kahn's book, Economic Development in the Soviet Union, published in 1970, page 71. End footnote. The effect this had was for the armaments to be directly responsible for around 2/3 of all capital accumulated in this period. Footnote: see H. Schwartz, The Soviet Economy Since Stalin, published in 1965. Since 1928, therefore, not only has consumption been subordinated to accumulation, but in addition we find the reasons for this in the competitive, coercive structure of world capitalism, which accounts for the vast bulk of Russia's tendency for accumulation for the sake of accumulation. It is not their own desires, therefore, but the logic of world capitalism which forces the bureaucracy to accumulate. New section: the dynamic of Russian society determined by the world around it. Basically, Russia is like one big factory, although if it had existed in a vacuum, the laws of capitalist development would cease to apply to it. That is obviously not the present case. Its actual behavior is therefore based upon the same laws which govern the actions of other corporations. Of course, you know that when corporations get very big and are drawn closer together with the state, we have to modify these laws. But the modifications are always on the basis of the original laws. And because of this, they always preserve the basic tendencies and contradictions, even if in a distorted form. All this is another way of saying that what we remarked upon at the beginning, that capitalism is a process and continuous movement, not an unchanging thing. We identify it by its inherent tendencies, by capitalism's dynamic. That's why we look to Russia's accumulation for accumulation's sake, based upon competition with Western capitalism, as the key to explaining changes in its internal structure, rather than the other way about. Marx himself argues in just the same way when he analyzes the economy of the plantation slaves in America in the 1850s. If you look purely at the internal workings of the plantations, there is a simple conclusion to be drawn. There is no internal labor market on the plantation, and the slave owners do not purchase labor power within the plantation. Elsewhere, Marx argued that for capitalism to exist, it had to be the case, quote, that the owner of the labor power should sell that labor power only for a definite period, for if he were to sell it rump and stump once and for all, he would be selling himself, converting himself from a free man into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. He must constantly look upon his labor power as his own property, his own commodity, and this he can do only by placing it at the disposal of the buyer temporarily, for a definite period of time. By this means alone can he avoid renouncing his rights of ownership over it. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, pages 186 to 187. End footnote. It follows from this that, looked at purely on their own, the plantation slave states were not capitalist. Yet looked at as a whole and considering their links with the rest of the world, Marx has no doubts, quote, ... we now not only call the plantation owners in America capitalists, end quote. He tells us, quote, but ... they are capitalists, end quote. This is because, quote, Negro slavery presupposes wage labor. And if other free states with wage labor did not exist alongside it, if instead the Negro states were isolated, then all social conditions there would immediately turn into pre-civilized forms, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, page 224. Marx's methodology is very clear here. Looked at purely on their own, the slave states lack an essential aspect of capitalism. Both in the context of a coercive world economy, the position changes. On the surface, there is no free wage labor, but because the plantation owners have to compete, for instance, with cotton-producing landlords from Egypt in the British market, they are compelled to exploit their slaves to a certain degree, to mechanize, and so on. It's a weird sentence because first of all, if each plantation was just an isolated unit that was not on the world market, they'd still be exploiting their slaves, right? Even if that didn't take the form of like profit, but rather in kind surplus appropriation. Yeah, that's just a side note from me. And I would say that um, American slave owners did not just exploit their slaves to a certain degree, um, as if it was like some kind of like light form of exploitation. External competition, therefore, and external competition alone, enforces on the plantations a capitalist dynamic and on the slaves a need to produce surplus value for the owners. For Marx, there was never any question of looking for a completely separate set of laws to explain the economy of the southern slave states. It was sufficient to show that, notwithstanding the fact that the plantation owner has not hired labor, but rather has bought the direct producers, quote, rump and stump, end quote, the plantations were forced to act as any other unit of capital would because of external coercion from rival capitalists. And this is debated. I would encourage you, if you're interested in the nature of the capitalist nature of slavery in the United States, check out the work of Charlie Post and the work of John Clegg. A key moment of deciding whether, I think like a pretty important linchpin on deciding whether you could properly call the agrarian South in the United States capitalist depends to some extent on how, at least a big part of it would be like, to what degree how easily could slaves be sold, right? One of the it's rather easy to shed labor from your labor process, right? And stop paying wages because you've stopped hiring people when you replace them with machinery to increase efficiency. But if you increase efficiency on a slave plantation, that doesn't necessarily rule out that that doesn't mean you don't necessarily can't as easily shed labor from the labor process, right? Because you own the slave as a means of production, as an instrument, basically, as basically like a piece of livestock. If you can sell the slave easily, then it would then that would make it possible for quote improvements or increases in efficiency to be implemented on plantations. But if that's not the case, if it's difficult to sell your slaves, that kind of disincentivizes slave plantation owners from rationalizing cotton production in the South, or mechanizing it, or anything of that sort. Obviously, there's some parts of it with that, and I'm not an expert on slavery, so I can't speak too much on it. But what some people will argue, and this is what Charlie Post argues, is that one of the main reasons for the Civil War, like breaking out, was that the slave economy in the South could only expand absolutely or totally, meaning it could only like spread its pre-existing arrangements to new lands, right? There was a certain degree of inefficiency within the plantation economy that because relative relative expansion was discouraged by the relative difficulty of selling slaves and shedding labor from the production process. there was a relative. The only way that the southern economy could grow was by expanding geographically westward, and that's what a big part of the the fights leading up to the Civil War was like, what are we going to do about these Western states? Are they going to be free states or are they going to be slave states? And so yeah, that's a very fun. Charlie Post basically argues to the effect that Southern slavery in the United States was not capitalist, even if it was market dependent. And for that reason had dynamics that were extremely specific unto itself. Back to the text. Exactly the same methodology reveals the capitalist nature of the bureaucracy in Russia. Of course, Russian workers are not slaves. They are paid in rubles. They have some choice of the enterprise they work in, and they can use their wages to purchase, within limits, the commodities of their choice. Casually using the word commodities there, that says something, right? Nonetheless, if Russia, quote, Inc., is in essence one single enterprise, then for all intents and purposes, from birth to death, the state bears all the cost of the upkeep of its workers, and in turn reaps all the benefits from their laboring activities. In this respect, the plantation owner and the Russian bureaucracy are in incomparable positions. What makes Russia part of the capitalist world system is not the fact that the workers are paid wages or can move from one state sector to another, but rather the fact that the Russian bureaucracy is forced to exploit them to a certain degree. I keep using that phrase, to a certain degree. Exploiting the dog shit out of them. To modernize the plant and equipment they work with, to accumulate capital, to distribute the workers from one sector to another, and is forced to do these things in the direction and to the extent that it is, solely because of the competitive pressure of the world around it. New section, use values and exchange values in Russia and the West. The difference between the southern slave owners and the bureaucracy in Russia today is, of course, that the bureaucracy in Russia sold the great bulk of their production on the world market. Jesus Christ. The difference between the southern slave owners and the bureaucracy in Russia today is, of course, that the southern slave owners sold the great bulk of their production on the world market, whereas foreign trade accounts for only a small fraction of the total production in Russia. And the amount that is traded outside the Comecon area is even smaller, less than a 20th of total production. So 5%. So this competition isn't even like market mediated at all. It's not market mediated at all. It's just like there's two superpowers. They both need industrial capacity. One operates on private property. The other operates on totally nationalized property. And they both have to industrialize. And the way to industrialize is to take surpluses and use those surpluses to expand the basis of the economy, to accumulate, right? To expand the productive base of the society, which in the West is undertaken privately and kind of haphazardly to some extent. And in Russia, it's, administered, and with the inefficiencies that come with bureaucratic planning. So this is they're not even capitalist due to market pressures from external things. It's strictly military, or almost strictly military. This combination of a centrally administered internal economy plus a low level of foreign trade has led many people to argue that Russia is not really a part of the capitalist world. They argue that Russia cannot be capitalist because the internal organization of the economy is not based upon competition of goods on the market. Firms produce according to instructions laid down by a central authority. Again, just that casual use of the word firms, right? That's a firm, in my opinion, is, or an enterprise even, as distinct from a unit of production or a site of production. I think firm clearly has a capitalist meaning, right? If you think of the the Bordigas argument against like market socialism or whatever, which is usually, to the degree to which it can be applied to to the people it criticizes, is dubious. But the hell of the firm is not that the firm has a boss, but that it's a firm, or however, or the hell of the firm isn't that the firm has a boss; it's the firm itself. It's because the firm is viewed in that phrase. The meaning of that phrase is that firms are a site of capitalist production. Right here, the word firm is not being used just to mean, is kind of being sloppily applied, where a site of production would be a much more appropriate term. Firm would imply some degree of autonomy in a market setting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't control language, but if we're trying to be like precise about categories and we have to be sharp and not just use like everyday terms of speech to describe things, but be very careful about the language. Anyway, let me repeat that last sentence, or the last paragraph. The combination of a centrally administered internal economy plus a low level of foreign trade has led many people to argue that Russia is not really part of the capitalist world. They argue that Russia cannot be capitalist because the internal organization of the economy is not based upon competition of goods on the market. Firms produce according to instructions laid down by a central authority. It is said that therefore, by definition, these firms cannot be turning out commodities, and Russia cannot be capitalist. Marx says that the production of goods which are not exchanged with other goods on the market is the production of use values, not exchange values. Quote, to become a commodity, a product must be transferred to another, to whom it will serve as a use value by means of an exchange, end quote. Therefore, it is argued, Russia cannot be capitalist. How are we to assess these arguments? To begin with, we should note that an important reason why external trade plays so small a role in Russia is that it is such a big country. Like the USA, Russia's proportion of foreign trade to total production is much less than with smaller countries. East Germany, for instance, socioeconomic structure more or less identical with that of Russia, trades a much higher proportion of its total production than either the USA or Russia. Also, we should note that if this argument were correct, then much of production in the West could not be capitalist either. We have mentioned already the large state sectors of the Western economies that flourished from the 1940s to the 1970s. But on top of that, there has been the substantial chunk of, quote, private industry that has produced only for the state, highway construction and armaments firms, for instance. And during the period of total war, from 1940 to 1945, state control of wages, prices, what was produced, how much, and by whom became far more total in Britain and Germany, archetypal Western capitalist nations, than is the norm in the economies of the Eastern Bloc countries today. Furthermore, the non-state sector in the West is increasingly dominated by giant corporations. In Britain today, 100 firms dominated by interlocking directorships control half the private sector production. Within both the state sector and the giant corporations, the individual productive units do not in the main produce for the market, but instead for other sections of the same enterprise, according to instructions laid down in advance. A single plant may well produce goods not for exchange, but for use by other plants inside the same combine. Yet in the long run, all the different stages of production within the factory tend to obey the laws of capitalism. Sorry, I'm thinking here. The fact that production within a firm takes place for the same firm is, and that being like not capitalist in some sense. I don't know, I'm trying to think here. Because like within production site, right, there's all these kind of like semi-finished products that are done. Say if you're making like, if you're working at a McDonald's, if you're making a burger and fries meal, there's the fry guy, and then there's the burger guy, and then there's the cashier, and all these things, and all these different moments of the of that single plant, that single company, are creating things with internal to the economy that are not mediated by a market exchange. I'm not really quite sure what I was originally trying to get at here, but if at some point these lines, no matter how big they are and how matter their internal, big, like large and complicated their internal division of labor is, doesn't rule them out from being capitalist if they're fundamentally producing a commodity that has to sell on a market. I don't know. A single plant may well produce goods not for exchange, but for use by other plants inside the same combine. Yet in the long run, all the different stages of production within the factory tend to obey the laws of capitalism. Yeah, because they're producing a commodity at the end of it that needs to be sold. I don't know. Apologize for all the marginalia. The individual capitalist is under pressure to impose the laws of capitalism within his own factory, even though there is planning within the factory in order to maximize his profit. Although workers in one part of the factory are producing use values for workers in other parts of the factory, not exchange values, their production is regulated by similar considerations as if they were producing commodities for the market. The external relations between the factory and the rest of the economy transform the different stages of production within the factory into stages of capitalist production. See, that's what I was trying to say before. The same considerations apply when we look at the operation of the giant corporations. Although vast areas of their operations are planned and very remote from the market, in the last analysis, their competition with other corporations ensures that capitalist laws prevail. Yeah, they're remote from the market within themselves. That's what production is. It's the private abode of production. And that is true of big companies as well as big capitals as well as smaller capitals. Production for the military needs of the state is not qualitatively different from this, although the goods involved are never going to be exchanged on a competitive market. In Britain, only 10% of arms are sold to anyone but the British government. Those who plan production are still compelled to impose the laws of capitalism on it. Normally, they do this by using various devices to compare the performance, costing, and so on in the arms sector with other sectors. On the basis of such measurement, the state agrees to the arms barons receiving a certain level of remuneration. I'm thinking here about um the way that like in like the the state isn't producing these weapons themselves; they're buying them from private contractors, right? And so, just like with any service that the state enterprises, the state has a budget. The state wants to get bang for its buck. The state does not want to arbitrarily shit out money to whoever, even though it does bail corporations out and things of that sort. It doesn't it has a spendthrift logic, and part of that is shopping around for better prices, and there's competition. Uh, there's a competitive nature. Um, there's a competitive market um, for arms. I mean, I'm not an expert on arms economy, but I'm sure this is the case. Is if like if you're buying arms from, say, like Lockheed Martin or whatever. And I'm again, like I was saying, I'm not an expert. What are the other Northrop Grumman or whatever the hell it is. Um, they probably almost definitely shop around and do not just pay these companies arbitrary prices. There is a limit to the prices that they'll pay, and there's not a monopoly on arms manufacturing. So the state is buying arms as opposed to just straight up manufacturing arms itself. But I don't know. So although the arms companies rarely compete for markets with anyone, they have to behave as if they do. Capitalism continues to exist, even though the state bureaucracy acts as a substitute for the market. I mean, I don't know if there's more than one arms company. I think they must compete with one another to some extent. Um, and I think if there was too much of a monopoly in the arms manufacturing trade, the state would institute some kind of antitrust law to break up their capacity to price gouge the state. Or just my guess. I'm talking about like things that are just like the logic of them. I don't know the actual facts of them, but just some basic considerations about how capitalism works. Just some, I guess they're theoretical comments that I'm making to myself. Capitalism continues to exist even though the state bureaucracy acts as a substitute for the market. I don't even know if you could say that the state is acting as a substitute for the market, because the state is a commodity owner. It owns money. It can purchase things. The advantage of the state, at least in like the Keynesian thing, is that it can do the opposite of what it's in like anybody's short-term rational self-interest to do, right? So in the Keynesian idea is that you spend money because nobody wants to spend money, and the fact that nobody wants to spend money means people stop buying shit, and more jobs get laid off, and more people stop spending money. So the state is there to like kind of be above the fray to a certain extent, and prime the pump and get the economy back going by spending when no one else is spending, or no one wants to spend. I don't know if you could say that that's a substitution for the market. It's a interesting relationship, but I don't think you could say it was a substitute for the market. In each case, the mechanisms that are employed internally are similar. Labor has to be exploited as efficiently as by the rival. Productivity has continually to be jacked up. Although the individual firm or country may plan its operations, the content of this, quote, plan depends on its relationship to its rival. If it cannot match its rival's increases in the rate of exploitation or advances in technology, then it will be in danger. What determines the internal organization of each country, as of each firm, is its relationship to a total system outside itself. That is why the huge arms sector of the U.S. economy today is a capitalist sector. It has to compare its productivity, its level of technology, and its labor costs with those of the rest of the Western countries and with the Russian economy. Because of the economic competition with Europe and Japan and military competition with Russia. What's being talked about here is if I can't speak to the facts or non-facts of this, but it's speaking here as if the arms sector of the U.S. economy was a nationalized sector that just produced directly for the state, which it doesn't seem like that's the case. Let me repeat that sentence. That is why the huge arms sector of the U.S. economy today is a capitalist sector. It has to compare its productivity, its level of technology, and its labor costs with those of the rest of the Western countries and with the Russian economy because of economic competition with Europe and Japan and military competition with Russia. Similarly, for the Russian economy as a whole, if it is dominated by arms production, as we have shown above, then it is dominated by its relationship with production outside Russia. What matters to the rulers of Russia is not how many use values they pile up in the abstract, but how these use values compare with the use values piled up by the American arms economy. But when two piles of use values are measured up against one another, they cease to be merely use values. They begin to have an exchange values. Their value no longer depends upon their intrinsic qualities, but upon their relationship to production throughout the world system. The very thing which the rulers of Russia worry about show how they are dominated in all their calculations by such considerations just as much as any Western corporation. When they talk about rates of growth, it is rates of growth compared with the West. They are not worried about the outputs of labor as such, but labor productivity compared with the West. They are obsessed with their low rate of innovation, again, compared with the West. The key areas of economic decision-making which affect workers are made according to the same sorts of calculations that apply in the West. How can the profitability of different sectors be improved? How can workers be persuaded to accept a cut in the labor force and increased output in return for more pay? What level of wages is needed to ensure the workers produce at the greatest possible speed? The consequences of the competitive relationship with the West are inescapable. Marx moves from an analysis of individual commodity production at the beginning of Volume 1 of Capital to the dynamic of capitalism, accumulation towards the end. This article began by showing that in Russia, as in the West, everything is subordinated to accumulation. Now we can see that accumulation is in turn the result of the competitive relationship between the Russian ruling class and its rivals, which transforms the output of Russian industry as a whole into production dominated by the essentially capitalist criterion of exchange value. It's very weird. Very, very weird. Because it's kind of like trans-historicizing competition as capitalist, any kind of competition whatsoever, as capitalist competition, right? That seems like I'm getting. That seems that I'm getting out of it, right? You have two use values, and you're comparing and their merits of those use values are put into like some kind of relationship with another set of use values, or just assets, just generally conceived better things, then it's a exchange relationship of some kind. It's a relationship of exchange value. So, like, I don't know, like, if in some sense, if I play a basketball game with my friends, and you in some sense, I don't know, this is just maybe this is too wild of an analogy, but it seems like if you're saying, like, I'm playing basketball with a group of friends, and me and my friend start comparing our skills, and start and like plan to compete with each other in some capacity, and we want to develop those certain skills, those certain assets, those certain use values that are attached to our person. Then we're because we're competing with each other and trying to optimize our basketball skills. Then we are operating. This means we're operating capitalistically. We've entered the terrain of exchange value from the sheer fact of comparing, from the sheer fact of being in competition with each other, and seeking to improve the utility of our bodies in the pursuit of playing basketball. We've thus entered into some kind of exchange relationship. Anyway, if Russia is economically speaking just like one huge corporation, then the familiar contradictions of capitalism must appear there too. That means that sooner or later the rate of profit must fall. In the West, this has in the past signaled the beginning of a slump. Investment ceases, demand declines, overproduction begins, and then capital values collapse. Out of the crisis, the weakest units of capital become bankrupt and are absorbed at bargain prices by the stronger units of capital. This restructures capital and makes it possible for it to function again. With rivals bankrupt and capital values much lower, the rate of profit temporarily recovers and the cycle begins anew. But in Russia, there is no such mechanism connecting overproduction with the restructuring of capital. Major investment decisions are centrally administered, and there is no means whereby the bureaucrat who makes the decisions will change them automatically. For the factory manager, too, it is a matter of indifference whether his goods get consumed or remain untouched in a warehouse, or whether his new factory premises are completed or left unfinished. I think that kind of right there signifies that there's something fishy about calling the form of wealth in the Soviet Union a commodity. If there's no problem of them being realized at all via purchase for the then I feel like that lends itself to thinking that like wealth isn't taking the form of a commodity. This is hardly a sign that the Russian economy is crisis-free. Exactly the opposite is the case. It is a clear indication that the economy is in a state of permanent crisis. Western capitalism has mechanisms of a greater or lesser efficiency for restructuring capital in crisis, but Russia has no such internal means of doing so. So further accumulation at this point actually does continue, but it fails to expand the sum total of use values in the economy. It has reached a state of permanent stagnation. That's kind of a weird thing to say that further accumulation continues but does not expand the sum total of use values. That doesn't seem to make any goddamn sense because the precondition, what accumulation is, in this kind of weird way, at least if we're just trying to be consistent with the terms, appears to be, is the expansion of plant. And that fundamentally is the expansion of use value. If accumulation is existing and new factories are being built, larger sums of use values are being produced. Accumulation, especially in this sense, and also in capitalism, is accompanied by an expansion, like a material expansion as well, right? Which is why capitalism is so devastating for the environment, right? Because accumulation has a material use value base. It actually does things in the material world at an accelerated rate. So it's weird to say that accumulation is taking place without an expansion of use values. That just seems like it doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the Soviet Union didn't have or never ran into like huge, serious stagnation problems, as was just said here. Russia has reached a state of permanent stagnation. That doesn't mean it's not true, but this kind of sloppy use of the word accumulation, and the fact that this got by the editors of this book, is pretty crazy to me. Only comparatively recently has this become of crucial importance. Until the 1950s, underutilized labor was so freely available that primitive accumulation could proceed and absorb new investment profitably. Until then, Russia could continue to devote its principal accumulation resources to expanding the means of production. But because all means of production must, after an initial lag, contribute to the means of consumption, this merely delayed the crisis. It cannot stop the state of permanent stagnation occurring, but only to delay the time when it appears. The return of the world capitalist system to crisis in the 1970s did not leave the Eastern state capitalist countries untouched. The evidence here is irrefutable. It can be seen in declining growth rates, falling rates of profit, marked cyclical tendencies, an increasing technology gap, and huge balance of payments deficits, which have required vast borrowing on the international finance market. The effects of this crisis on the Eastern Bloc economies have been very serious indeed. Firstly, even before the crisis of 1974 and 1980, there was a marked and continuous decline in growth rates not only in Russia, but in all the Eastern European state capitalist economies. Only Poland was able to stave off crisis in this period, but at the cost of suffering more than any other major capitalist nation, East or West, in the crisis of 1974 and especially 1980. Poland kept up its growth by a massive increase in trade with the West, which was itself undergoing a short but very rapid boom from 1971 to 1973. Imports from the West tripled from 1970 to 1973. And by 1975, only 45% of Poland's trade was with the other Eastern Bloc countries put together. Then came the slump. Poland's exports plummeted, and the cost of the imports needed to maintain growth soared. There's a chart here that I'm not going to read out because it's just going to be annoying. Having participated in the world boom, the Polish bureaucracy was hit by the inflationary pressures it created. By 1975, Eastern Europe's net borrowing from the West rocketed to $20 billion, of which Poland's share was the then incredible sum of $7 billion. Footnote, see Harman's article, Poland, the Crisis of State Capitalism, published in International Socialism, First Series, number 93. End footnote. Servicing this debt took a quarter of all its foreign earnings. The process was repeated in a much more extreme way in the 1980 crisis, but this time servicing the new debt of over $20 billion took more than 90% of Poland's foreign earnings, and there was a massive fall in production of at least 15% in 1981. Footnote. See Colin Barker and Kara Weber, Solidarność from Gdansk to Military Repression, published in 1982. End footnote. Until recently, the USSR, however, still had a surplus rural population, and hence from 1950 to 1970, it was able to expand the urban labor force by around 40% per year. Even with stagnant labor productivity, it was therefore guaranteed a minimum growth rate of 4%. But today, the urban labor force is growing at less than 1% per year, and it has therefore become crucial to expand productivity. Footnote. See Grossman, The Problems of Communism. End footnote. The urgency is revealed by the fact that today the Eastern European economies have growth rates that are broadly similar to those of the Western countries, somewhat better than Britain and somewhat worse than Japan. But they are only able to achieve this on the basis of twice the level of investment. Footnote. See Harman, Bureaucracy and Revolution in Eastern Europe. This would suggest then a rough and ready figure for the rate of profit of about 50% of that prevailing in the West. Russia today is more than ever dependent on wheat from the Americas and high technology engineering from Europe and Japan. It is quite beyond its own technological and financial resources to launch many of its most important investments without partnerships with the West. The Russian state capitalist ruling class is therefore constrained by just the same forces as those applying in the West, while more and more its own activities contribute to and suffer from the rhythm of the world market. As in the West, socialism can be achieved in Russia only through a workers' revolution that totally destroys the power of the ruling class and replaces it with workers' power from below and on an international basis. There can be no halfway measures or fudged compromises. Gorbachev's Russia is not even a partially, quote, progressive formation, and its ruling class is as much a barrier to socialism for Russian workers as are the ruling classes in the West for Western workers. That's the end. Thank you so much for listening.